last forum presentations for the beginning of the summer. We'll be taking a hiatus in July and August. So we have this today and then one in 2 weeks, and I think 2 weeks after that, and then we'll be quiet for a while. So I am Jeff Peckrell. I am the co-chair of the Human Rights Working Group, along with Melvin and Dolores. And this meeting is a co-presentation of the Human Rights Working Group and Forum, which are slightly distinct entities, but we collaborate, to produce events like this. So welcome. If you didn't sign in when you came in, you might want to do that so that we can communicate with you in the future. The emails we send out will include links to a site where you could view a recording of this, which you might want to share with someone else who, if you really enjoy today's talk, you'd like to see the recording and share it with someone else, and I would encourage you to do that. So with that, I'd like to introduce David Heilbrunn, who is going to give our Ohlone recognition before we have our speaker. One final note of logistics is we do our Q&A at the end, and if you have any questions, please write them down, and then Robin Larson will be basically moderating the Q&A session, taking your questions and reading them for our speaker. Thank you.
Good morning. We, the members of the First Unitarian Universalist Society of San Francisco, acknowledge that our community is located on the ancestral homeland of the Ramaytush Ohlone people, who inhabited what is now the San Francisco Peninsula. Anthropologists say that these indigenous communities lived in and moved through the area for over 10,000 years. As the original stewards of this land, the Ohlone and other indigenous peoples understood the interconnectedness of all things and maintained harmony with all of nature for millennia. We honor them now for their enduring commitment to our Mother Earth. Thank you.
Good morning. I'm Dolores Perez Heilbrunn, and I am very proud today to introduce our speaker, Wayne Hsiung, a member of this congregation. Wayne is an outstanding attorney who has successfully defended the rights of animals and those who seek to protect them. He is a hero to many of us who love animals, and not just our cuddly companion cats and dogs, but all the sentient beings of this earth. He is an activist and co-founder of the Simple Heart Initiative and Direct Action Everywhere, which he will tell us more about. Wayne is devoting his life to making the world a better place for all species. He offers hope and specific suggestions on how we can protect our planet from destruction due to the gross misuse of our natural environment. We hope you will all give his ideas your serious consideration. Welcome, Wayne. Happy to see you.
Really excited to be here and excited to be a member. I'm going to try and remember some advice Dolores gave me, which is to speak a little more slowly. I, unfortunately, am a part of the Instagram and TikTok generation. And on Instagram and TikTok, the incentive is the opposite. You're trying to get as much out in 60 seconds or 30 seconds as you can. So I'm going to try to be deliberate about slowing down. If anyone wants to give me a cue, if I'm speaking a little too fast, David, Dolores, feel free to do so. But let me share my screen first, and then we'll get started. Okay, so plant-based food is the future. One of the reasons I kind of instantly connected this congregation about a year ago, just about a year ago when I moved to San Francisco, was because of the deep set of values relating to kindness and empathy. But in particular, what I noticed in the principles was that there was a value specifically about our kindness and empathy and connection, not just to each other as human beings, but to the planet, to the other living beings of this earth. And of course, we do share this planet with billions upon billions, and in fact, trillions upon trillions of other creatures. And we're going through at this point in the planet's history what's called the sixth mass extinction. So climate change alone could be committing to extinction anywhere from 40,000 to 130,000 species in the next 20 years. One of the most terrifying things that many of us read about just a few months ago is that polar bears, one of the iconic species of this planet, will now be committed to extinction. Unless there's a reversal, the population pattern is that within the next 20 years, they will disappear from the wild entirely. And some of these stories are terrifying, you know, of the ancestral homelands of these majestic creatures that for hundreds of thousands of years have been filled with polar ice caps, these mother polar bears that will swim out because they usually will have a den on the south where it's a little warmer for their babies. Then sometimes they'll swim out to the north, expecting to find ice caps upon which they can hunt. But these ice caps that have existed for, in some cases, hundreds of thousands of years just aren't there anymore. And they keep swimming and swimming and swimming. And they know, I have to find these ice caps. If I don't find these ice caps, I cannot hunt. Because these are not aquatic hunting animals. They're not like sharks. They hunt on the ice. And so you have polar bear mothers that are swimming further and further north. And there have been sightings of polar bears that are literally struggling to swim and drowning to death in the Arctic oceans. And of course, their babies will starve to death too because these moms don't come home. So there are so many devastating consequences of climate change on the environment. But today's talk is not going to be so much about the consequences of climate change and environmental devastation, but the causes. And I want to frame it in a positive direction rather than a negative direction. So instead of blaming factory farming and animal agriculture for all these problems, I'm going to talk about the solution and why I think plant-based food is the future if we are going to save this planet. And I truly do believe that people are invested, motivated, educated about these issues, so they're willing to do what it's going to take to save our Earth, because it's our one and our only home. Okay, but we're not actually the first people to realize the importance of plant-based food. Oh, what happened? Okay. I think, actually, let me turn this off slideshow, because I think it's automatically. Let's see, why is it not sharing? Let me try and share this again. Share screen, PowerPoint, there we go. Okay. We are not the first, this is not the first moment in American history where folks have recognized the dramatic footprint of the livestock industry. Does anyone know who these two people are and what this is a picture of? Who are these two people? John Muir and Teddy Roosevelt. And what is the backdrop here? It's close to here. Yeah. Yeah, so this is one of our great national parks. And the national park system was established partly due to Teddy Roosevelt and John Muir 100 years ago in the Bay Area. In fact, John Muir and two professors at the University of California at Berkeley met in San Francisco and said, we have to do something because there's something destroying these beautiful landscapes. And in fact, John Muir described it as very similar to a locust horde. And if any of you have seen a locust horde, it's kind of astonishing how in the span of a day or two, locusts can swarm and destroy an entire natural landscape. The plant life, the leaves, even the grain and grass off the ground can be completely destroyed in the matter of days. And John Muir was explaining to Teddy Roosevelt, as a naturalist who spent enormous time in these beautiful landscapes, these places, again, for hundreds of thousands, millions of years, have just depicted scenes of equilibrium and balance and ecology and beauty in a way that's unprecedented on the planet. I mean, Yosemite, for example, is just one of the most beautiful places on the planet. These places are being destroyed, and they're being left in a state that's as if a locust horde has swarmed. And what was the thing that he pointed to, do you think, back in the early 20th and late 19th century that was causing these locust horde-like destructive impacts? What industry was it? Livestock. Yeah. Livestock of all sorts. So livestock would be coming into areas like this and stripping every tree of their leaves. All the grains were gone, and turning a beautiful natural landscape filled with greenery into barren gray and brown. And I actually saw this myself recently. I have a friend who has 40 acres of land in San Luis Obispo. 40 acres is quite a bit of land. They have a farmstead. And because of the recent storms, they actually had to block off half of their farmstead because it was basically so much water had eroded the land. It was unsafe for the animals they had on their farmstead to go onto half of the farmstead. And it was pretty shocking. I went to her farmstead once, I think in January, and came back in March. And in the span of 2 months, the portion of the farmstead that was blocked off from the animals, the livestock they had on this particular farmstead, had become completely green. There were plants everywhere. The trees were full of leaves and flowers. On the other hand, the portion of the farmstead, the 20 acres that still had the animals, was barren. It was almost like a desert. And guess how many cows she has on this farmstead? Just 2. 2 cows. Made a night and day difference in just 2 months. And for the record, this is a farmstead where they don't hurt the animals. They care for the animals. It's a place where orphaned and abused animals go. But even those 2 cows were able to completely destroy somewhere around 20 acres in 2 months. 2 cows. So you can imagine what happens when it's not 2, but hundreds of thousands. And what happens is this. This is an image that was taken recently in Brazil. And this is an image of an area that was once filled with rainforest. And many of you probably know that the Amazon rainforest is considered the lungs of our planet, right? So much of the oxygen, so much of the carbon dioxide on our planet is processed and turned into oxygen by the Amazon. Shocking percentage. And the number one greatest threat to the Amazon is the livestock industry. And Jair Bolsonaro was the recent president of Brazil, who's thankfully ousted, from my perspective. And one of the number one things he did was allow more and more cattle to roam through the Amazon, destroying the rainforest. Now more and more ranchers, including large multinational corporations like JBS, to produce more beef to export to places like the United States, because the United States and Europe remain the largest per capita meat consumers in the world. So the problem isn't so much of the people of Brazil or the people of South America, because they actually considerably less meat than us on a per capita basis, mostly because they're just less rich than us. It's the people in the United States and Europe who are eating all this beef and causing this devastation. But the Washington Post recently did an expose showing that not only are these beautiful natural landscapes being destroyed, killing off the lungs of our planet, but a huge amount of it is actually illegal. So they did an examination of kind of land permits and cattle ranchers in Brazil that were being sold, their products being sold in the United States, and found that there were 1,673 cattle purchases from 114 ranchers just from the year 2018 to 2020 who were all illegally grazing. And illegally in a country that had already loosened its regulations considerably. Bolsonaro had already said, it's basically carte blanche, you can do whatever you want, but there are a few things you can't do. Can we preserve at least a small portion of the Amazon so our planet does not die from climate change? And even the very limited restrictions Bolsonaro imposed from 2018 to 2020, about 1,673 mass purchases by 114 ranchers. And there aren't that many ranchers left, because all these ranchers are becoming mass corporate organizations. It's not like someone like my friend Hsiung who has 2 cows. It's a ranching company that has 200,000 cows. That huge amount of this is being done illegally, even in the nation of Brazil, where there are not many restrictions, and being sold to us at places like Costco. And in fact, if you look worldwide, it's not just the Amazon that's been devastated. It's our entire planet. In 2006, the UN put out a report that was really the first clarion call about the dangers of the livestock industry. It was called Livestock's Long Shadow. And it accumulated, or attempted to accumulate, all the best ecological science, public health reports, climate change research to determine what is the impact of livestock in the meat industry on our planet. And they determined that about 70%, that's 7 out of 10, not 17, but 70% of all the arable land on this planet, all the land we can use for food production, was being used to produce animals, while only 18% of the calories. So relatively small percentage of the actual food being produced was being used by animal agriculture, but a huge amount of the land. That number as of 2018 is now 77%. 77%. So it's almost 4 out of 5 acres on this planet are being used to produce animals who are not producing much food. And in fact, historically, I am a vegan and I support a vegan diet, but I've actually been pretty skeptical of a lot of the reports. I was skeptical of the 2006 UN report because I actually personally knew some of the climate scientists at the University of Chicago whose research was used to publish the Livestock Long Shadow report. And advocates of all sorts are known to embellish and exaggerate sometimes. And I actually felt like our movement back in 2006 was embellishing a little bit. That report was probably most famous for saying that livestock was the largest contributor to climate change. Those numbers actually were revised. It went from 18% in the 2006 report down to 14%, mostly because the analysis the UN did for agriculture was not a full life cycle analysis, while the analysis they were doing for other sectors like transit was a full life cycle analysis. And what that means is when they were looking at animal agriculture, they were looking at all the different components of animal agriculture, including transit, production, sale, packaging, and all those things. While they were looking at transit, for example, they're only looking at the direct emissions of transit. While it's not just the carbon dioxide from your tailpipe that's going to the environment, it's also the production of the car. It's also the transit of the gasoline and the extraction of the gasoline. It's also the methane coming from the various fossil fuel production facilities. So historically, I've been a skeptic of saying that animal agriculture is the #1 contributor, at least to climate change. But over the last 5 years, my skepticism has completely reversed itself, because there have been a number of reports in the top peer-reviewed journals in the world, including Science Magazine, Nature, Proceedings for the National Academy of Sciences. Those are probably the big three in the sciences. Those are the three most prominent peer-reviewed journals. And I'll just quote from one report by Oxford University scientists in Science Magazine. And this is from the publication itself. It's not from a media account. It's not a quote that's taken out of context. Most strikingly, impacts, and this is a quote, most strikingly, impacts of the lowest impact animal products typically exceed those of vegetable substitutes, providing new evidence for the importance of dietary change. In other words, if you look at the total environmental footprint of the lowest impact animal products, meaning things like chicken and fish, relative to something like cattle ranching, even the lowest impact animal products are causing more environmental devastation like this than the highest impact plant-based products. And there have been a number of other studies that I could send to you in Nature and PNAS. There was another study arguing that and showing that it would be impossible, and this is the study's terminology, not my terminology, impossible for us to limit greenhouse gas emissions and global temperature increases to 1.5 degrees Celsius, which many scientists consider the red line, 1.5 degrees Celsius. If we get to 2, that's bad. We cannot, it is impossible to limit climate change to 1.5 degrees Celsius unless we transform our food system because of the contributions of climate change. But another big issue in California is water, right? This is an image taken from Lake Mead just a couple years ago. Does anyone know where Lake Mead is and what its importance is? Say again? Yeah, it's in Las Vegas. But what's the importance of Lake Mead? It's the largest of something in the nation. Reservoir. Yeah, when it's full, when it's actually intact, which as you can see, it is not intact right now, it is the largest reservoir of water in the nation, and it supplies 20 million Americans in 3 states, Arizona, Nevada, and California, with water. 20 million Americans in those 3 states means 4 out of 10. So if you just look around, about 4 out of 10 of us are getting water, or I should say we're getting water, from Lake Mead. That is no longer happening. In fact, Lake Mead's water levels have dropped 170 feet since 2000. And what's causing it to dry up? Well, Lake Mead is fed into by a very important river. And Dolores and Dave actually just shared with me some recent reporting at the New York Times about what's happening to the Colorado River. What's happening to the Colorado River is it is drying up, right? And you might be wondering, well, it's so sad. It's these droughts and we're not getting enough rainfall. That's not actually the reason it's drying up. And when ecologists have looked at the reason the Colorado River is drying up, it's primarily because of human use and overuse of this water. But again, you might say like, well, if these 20 million Americans, like, why are people watering their lawns so much? Why do they have to take such long showers? What a waste of water. What is wrong with people? We could try and blame other citizens and consumers. But you want to guess, when there was an analysis done of what was causing the Colorado River to dry up, what percentage of it was residential use? Things like watering your lawn. It's 12%, very small. So only about 1 in 10, 1 in 8 gallons of water from Colorado River that were causing Lake Mead to dry up and sacrificing the water security for 20 million Americans was residential. What about commercial and industrial uses? What percentage do you think was commercial and industrial? Because you got a lot of factories, they have to wash things, produce things. What percentage do you think was commercial and industrial? 4%. It's actually less than residential, so about 4%. And by far, the largest was agriculture, right? In fact, 75 to 80%. But what percentage of this agricultural water usage was for non-animal-based agriculture? Any guesses? It's about 23%. By far, the single largest contributor to this, in fact, 56% of the water that's being taken out of the Colorado River and leading to drinking water reservoirs looking like this within 20 years. Again, this is the 20-year time period. We're not talking about short time horizons. This is a very short time horizon. Going to places like this to feed animals like this and water animals like this and regrow devastating pastures like this, 56% of it is going to animal agriculture, right? And one of the reasons 56% of this is going to animal agriculture, and this is actually the story Dolores sent me, is because the water usage by animal agriculture, does anyone have a water bill in their personal home? They have to pay your own water bill? How's it been going over the last 10 years? Up. Yeah, and maybe you've seen some surcharges. Have you noticed surcharges? There have been surcharges. In fact, the California legislature is allowed for surcharges against ordinary consumers. And there's a lot of naming and shaming of individual consumers and households. Like, you know, there's a little bit of shame now to anyone who's got a lawn, right? And the government and the industry love to say, and I'm not saying you should have a lawn. I'm not saying it's a great thing to go and have a lawn and shower water into it when we're going through a historic period of drought. But the reason that 56% of the water is being used in animal agriculture is because while many Americans are seeing their water bills go up and up and up, I've got friends who have, 1/10 of an acre who are paying $400 or $500 a month in just water bills because of all these surcharges. What percentage of the rates that we're paying do you think animal agriculture is paying? In other words, if we've got to pay $1 a gallon, how much do you think animal agriculture has to pay under state law? Any guesses? What percentage? 25%. Any other guess? 4%. Go lower. 2%. So because of all the subsidies that animal agriculture is getting, which essentially they just basically get discounted rates. So if you're paying $200, they're paying $4 on a monthly basis for the same amount of water. And it's causing things like this, right? And so this is also one of the reasons why a number of companies have been starting up. And I'm not saying capitalism is, the panacea for all the environmental problems of this planet. But I do think some of the technologies that are being conceived of and some of the historic and in some cases ancient food practices. I come from a culture where eating plant-based proteins has been in existence for thousands of years. The Chinese started eating tofu and seitan, these plant-based protein products. Buddhists were inventing these products from natural products, just washing the grain until we have the protein left, cultivating the beans so we can create tofu. But this is an example of something that's local to our area, Impossible Foods Factory in the East Bay. Anyone want to guess? Impossible has essentially the same nutritional composition as a beef-based burger. What percentage of the water that a beef-based burger is using do you think is used by an Impossible burger? So it's about 13%. So each Impossible burger uses 87% less water than a beef-based burger. So you're cutting into this massive 56%. We could get that 56% down to something like 5%, right? If we had bought Impossible burgers instead of beef-based burgers. And what percentage of the land do you think an Impossible burger uses? According to the UN. And this is not Impossible itself. This is the UN did an estimate of specifically just this one product and asked, if we replaced all beef-based burgers with Impossible burgers, what percentage of the land use would be relieved of the damage that's being caused like this? Got to go higher. 96%. 96%, right? And the reason is because almost all of the animal-based foods and water that we're creating are used with the same basic ingredients as the plant-based burgers. And there's energy inefficiency, right? Because if you're feeding all these plants that we could be eating to the animals, there's a huge loss just thermodynamically in that the animal is using a lot of the energy to live. In the case of a cow, 18 to 24 months. In the case of a pig, about 6 months. In the case of a chicken, only 6 weeks. And that leads me to the second point, which is energy efficiency. One of the reasons that the economic and environmental fundamentals are so bad for animal-based agriculture is basic laws of thermodynamics, right? A cow, to live and walk and move and reproduce and grow, is using energy. Where do they get that energy? From food. And where does that food come from? It comes from the same foods that we eat because we are omnivores. We can eat many of the same foods, not all of them, but many of the same foods, and in fact, most of the same foods that the cows are eating. And so Yale University has done some analysis just about the thermodynamics of food and tried to understand, just from a thermodynamics perspective, just basic physics, energy. In terms of calories in and calories out, how many calories of plant-based food that human beings could consume ourselves go into creating 1 calorie of beef? And this is actually an image of a feedlot, the way animals are being raised. You can see the grains that are being fed to these animals, usually for the last 6 months before they eat. So for beef, what do you think the calorie in to calorie out ratio is for cattle? Any guesses? Just throw a number out there. 5 to 1. You got to go higher, unfortunately, Bruce. 800? No, it's not that high. 25 to 1. 25 to 1. So somewhere between those two. So for every 25 calories of energy that could be going to feed a human being, and we are suffering from food insecurity, even in the United States. There are a lot of impoverished children who don't have enough food. If you look worldwide, there are probably about 1 billion people around the world who are suffering from food insecurity. And we are literally wasting, 95+% of our food by feeding it into cows and only getting 5% or less of return, or 4% of return. And the numbers are similarly bad, although not quite as bad for other common types of meat production. Pork production, it's something like 15 to 1, according to Yale. And chicken production is the best, but still 9 to 1. So you're still wasting about 90%, 88, 85% of your calories, right? All being thrown away. So the way to imagine this is imagine every time you went to a restaurant, you had to buy 25 meals, and 24 of them would just be thrown away. And then you get to eat 1. And you had to pay for all of them. Environmentally, economically, in terms of public health, and in terms of food security, our animal-based food system is doing exactly that. It's as if we're going into a restaurant, buying 25 meals and throwing 24 of them away. Okay. This is a nice chart that the UN put out, which shows you just kind of the amount of energy required to use different types of food. And Jeff, I was telling you about this earlier, about how eggs, surprisingly, are actually a very energy-inefficient food. Because the chickens have to eat a lot of food to produce a small number of eggs, and there's a lot of waste material. There's the shell, there's the thermodynamics of just keeping the chicken alive over a 2-year time period. So this kind of shows you how, across the board, grains are efficient. They have relatively little input to get relatively little output. But for all the other products, you can see it's all the plant-based products on the left and all the animal-based products on the right, which is, again, one of the reasons why Science Magazine recently published peer-reviewed research showing that virtually all of the animal-based foods, including the most energy-efficient animal-based foods, are worse than even the worst plant-based foods. Okay. So I want to last just talk about climate change, because I mentioned earlier that back in 2006, I was actually a law student who was publishing research on climate change in animals. And I was pretty skeptical of some of the initial research, suggesting that 18% of all greenhouse gas emissions were caused by animal agriculture. I thought it was significant, but probably more like 12%. And I thought there were areas like building energy usage, heating and cooling, transit that were probably greater sectors. And I still am not 100% sure that animal agriculture is the #1 contributor, but what I will say is there have been a number of studies, including a study in PNAS, the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, that have basically convinced me that I'm wrong. And one of the reasons is this. This is a pig farm in North Carolina. And as you can see, you have the pig farm, and then you have the poop. For every square foot of pig farm, you're going to have at least an equivalent square foot of manure lagoons. And these manure lagoons are not just devastating for the local communities because, for example, when there's a hurricane or flooding, all of the feces and antibiotics and organisms in these lagoons will literally flood the local neighborhoods, schoolyards, playgrounds, people's homes. And typically, if you look at a pig farm, the surrounding communities are almost always poor, they're people of color. Nobody wants to live near one of these pig farms because, as far away as 30 miles away, I have done investigations and surveillance at a pig farm in Utah. In fact, it's the largest pig farm in the nation, called Circle 4 Farms. There's a community 30 miles away that when the wind blows east, everybody in that community says, we can't come outside. Like, we literally just can't come outside. It stinks so bad. It smells like we're living in a toilet, right? So imagine living next to one of these, having, a flood, having the wind. And it's not just that. One of the ways they deplete the feces and refuse from the lagoons is just by spraying it into the air. They literally get these hoses hooked up, and they spray it into the local air because it's cheaper than trying to process it, and putting it into sewage is potentially dangerous because drinking water can become contaminated. So they just spray it in the air. They claim it's fertilizer, but it's not a very effective fertilizer, and it causes a lot of health issues in local communities. But one of the things that's been found more recently is that there is a massive amount of methane being produced in these manure lagoons because of the decomposition of various organic matters just emitting methane. And methane, it turns out, is not just a much more powerful, in fact, many times, orders of magnitude, or an order of magnitude or more powerful greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide. But one of the reasons the 2006 estimates were lower than they are today is because we thought methane decayed in the atmosphere much faster than it actually does. So back in 2006, when the UN first released the Livestock's Long Shadow Report, the idea was methane, yes, it's 40x more active as a greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide, but it also decays much faster. While carbon dioxide might be for hundreds of years, methane might decay within decades. And there's been some pretty compelling research showing it's not happening as fast as we thought for various reasons. But of course, there's also cows, right? And many of you may have heard that cows are ruminants. In other words, they have multiple stomachs, and they're degrading biological material that would normally trap a lot of carbon dioxide, but they're degrading these multiple stomachs that all ruminants have, letting it engage in fermentation, very similar to what happens to organic matter in one of these lagoons. But they're very efficient at fermentation. In fact, they have to be, because they need to be able to process these grasses and grains they're eating quickly. And it turns out enteric fermentation is one of the most devastating contributors to greenhouse gases, which is why cows and sheep, which are both ruminants, pigs, which you see below, are not ruminants, so they don't engage in the same enteric fermentation process in their digestive system, and therefore are not burping up massive amounts of methane. But cows and sheep are the biggest contributors. And in fact, you might think, okay, well, the problem is the factory farming, right? The problem is we're giving them all these grains in feedlots. In fact, sadly, from an animal welfare perspective, that's actually not the case. The grass-fed free-range cows, because they actually have to engage in more processing or breaking down more plants to produce a smaller number of calories, because grain is a very efficient, as you can see from these numbers, it's very efficient at producing energy for both cows and for us. But when you change to grass-fed beef, the estimates are there anywhere from 17 to 87% more greenhouse gas emissions. Right? So as bad as it already is, greenhouse gas impact in kilograms of CO2 for getting just 50 grams of protein. If we go grass-fed, it actually gets worse. And this is just milk as well. You can see the difference between plant-based milks and animal-based milks. And again, this is all research published. You can't see the caption is blocking off the source. The source for this is not an advocacy organization. It's not a vegetarian or vegan. It's scientists at Oxford University in the magazine Science. And again, Science is the premier peer-reviewed journal in the world, heavily scrutinized research. It managed to survive that peer review process because I think the science is becoming clear that animal-based foods are incredibly destructive for our planet. Okay, but the last thing I want to say before I open things up for questions is there's a pragmatic scientific point I'm trying to make, and I hope I've convinced you now with charts like this and with images like this one, and this one, that increasingly are far removed from the urban landscapes we live in, because in the United States, we live in places like San Francisco, so when we buy beef from Costco, we don't have to think about what's happening in the Amazon to these beautiful natural landscapes, what's happening to our air and our water, what's happening to our climate, right? Because we just see the final product, and a lot of these companies are just not very transparent about what's actually happening and produce these things. So there's an incredible just educational, pragmatic component to what I'm trying to say about the future of food. But there's also a conceptual point. And the conceptual point is this, that all of these various problems are because of a food system that is misaligned with our values. Most people do not see this and say, oh, this looks great. Let's do some more of this. Right? They don't see this, the largest drinking water reservoir in the United States, and see it drying up and dropping by 170 feet in 20 years and saying, yeah, that seems like a good idea. Let's make sure no one has any water left, and that we get to a point where people may be fighting civil wars over access to water. And this is something ecologists have actually said. In the next 100 years, if water keeps going the way it's going, we're going to live in a society almost like one of these dystopian Mad Max societies where people are fighting for a bottle of water. They literally have to kill each other because to survive, you need water. And if everything goes to this, we're going to be fighting for water. Most people don't like that. They don't like the idea of that sort of dystopia. And the reason this is all going in this direction relates to something that unfolded just a couple months ago that Dolores flagged for me, which is this fire. You can't see the bottom. Is there some way for me to get rid of these captions so people can see them? It's okay. It doesn't actually matter. But this is a smoke billowing from a dairy farm in Texas. And at this dairy farm, there are 18,000 cows and calves at one farm. 18,000. So again, I told you about the impact of 2 cows on 20 acres. 18,000. And these images were taken from afar, from a highway, because when this fire broke out and 18,000 living beings burned alive, the farm didn't show any images of what happened inside. Right? You might wonder, how could 18,000 animals all die in one fire? And the reason is they're confined in environments like this. And this is a farm in Central California that has 14,000 cows, so it actually has fewer cows. And every one of these tiny baby cows, usually within minutes or at most hours of their birth, they're torn from their mothers and thrown into a crate like this. And this is drone footage that our team shot, and I'll just show you the sheer scale. Each of these wooden hutches is about 4 feet by 6 feet. This poor baby will live in 24 square feet of space for the first few months, sometimes, in some cases, years of life. And if there's a fire that breaks out, each of these living beings is in a wooden tomb that they will not be able to escape from. And again, this is a small snapshot of a much larger farm. 14,000 little crates like this at this farm, 18,000 at this farm in Texas. And what does this have to do with what I was saying earlier about the environment? Well, the problem with our system right now, and our food system, is that it is completely disconnected from all life on this earth. It's completely disconnected from the fact that the life on this earth, the natural systems, and the other living beings are not just things for us to consume. They're living beings for us to protect. They're ecosystems that give vitality, that are the lungs of our entire society, the Amazon. Scientists have described it as the lungs of our society. And if we treat the lungs of our society, if we treat the other living beings of this earth like commodities that can be burned up 18,000 in a short span of time in a fire, if you treat other living beings like these baby cows, like commodities that can be thrown into wooden crates, that when there is a fire, it's like, I guess 14,000 are going to burn alive because they're all in little crates and we don't even have time. Even if you tried to save these cows, it would take the entire state of California working to try to save just the cows from this one farm if a fire broke out here. And so our system is being constructed in a way that's treating life, living ecosystems, and our entire planet as a mere commodity to consume and sometimes to waste, whether it's for food. Again, the 24 meals you have to throw away to get the one meal. That's an animal-based food product. In terms of the land usage, the 97% of land that's wasted to make beef-based burgers over Impossible Burgers. For water, the 86% of water that's basically thrown into the drain at a time when our society is facing historic shortages of water, leading to drinking water reservoirs that look like this. In all these cases, the more fundamental problem isn't just that we've been mistaken. It isn't just that we're not educated. It's about the fact that our most powerful political and economic systems are aligned towards making a profit for a small handful of extremely large corporations rather than reflecting the real moral truth of our society, which is that all living beings matter. All living beings deserve dignity and respect, and even our living ecosystem needs to be given some basic modicum of respect if life on this earth is going to survive. So I told you at the beginning about the polar bears and that we're going through the 6th mass extinction, partly because of the conceptual corruption of our political system, of our economic system, and our food system, that mass extinction is not just sending the other animals of this earth, but even our own species to our own demise. Unless we reverse it, that is where we're headed. But what I want to end with, and this is why I ended with a positive note, this is actually one of the 2 cows at the sanctuary. This is when she was a baby.
Yeah, I think so too.
And this is a calf that was actually taken from this facility. She was taken from one of these hutches. She was sick and collapsed on the ground. She was removed by my friend Julianne, who's now a financial executive at Google. At the time, she was an MBA at Dartmouth. And she took time during her summer at Dartmouth to come save a baby cow because she realized what I think most people realize, that what we're seeing here is unconscionable from an animal welfare perspective, from an environmental perspective, from just a human decency perspective. And so what she did was she flew drones like this, she took photos, and she tried to give aid to one of these cows and treated this other living being the way she deserved to be treated. Not as a commodity, but as a fellow living being, part of a vibrant ecosystem that all of us depend on to survive. And if we can shift our thinking in terms of food and see animals like Rosa, and that's her name, this baby cow, not just as a food source or a commodity for us to use and consume, to incredible waste, not just for her, for the baby cow and her mother, but for us too, and conceive of a different sort of relationship where we care for the other living beings, we care for our natural systems, and do not allow these corporations to run roughshod over the lungs of our entire planet, then I'm confident that we can reverse these problems and make sure we do limit climate change to at worst 1.5 degrees Celsius. We can prevent reservoirs like Lake Mead from disappearing from the face of the planet Earth, and we can stop the 6th mass extinction in this planet's history, including the extinction of our own species. And so I'm very excited that we have plant-based foods today. Hopefully you found them delicious. There are plant-based foods available all across the Bay Area now. Some of the most important companies working in this area, some of the important universities, University of California, Berkeley, and Stanford University, both have very promising initiatives to find ways to facilitate the growth of a plant-based food system and give people all the delicious, nourishing protein they need from plant-based sources. And I'm also very glad that this particular congregation has done such a wonderful job of lecturing and talking about what's happening to the natural world. There's a sermon just a couple months ago about dominion and how the flawed nature of this concept of dominion, that we are just tyrants over the planet, and that we're increasingly offering our members plant-based foods. I've noticed there's plant-based milks at our coffee. We have plant-based breakfast today, and I'm really excited to encourage and support that, and I'm glad you're all here to do it as well. So thank you all very much, and I think with that, we'll probably open things up for questions. Could I just do like kind of a straw poll? How many of you knew some of the, at least some of this information today about, okay, it sounds like most people. Yeah. How much of it? So what was the thing that was most leapt out for you, Raymond? That surprised you?
Well, the percentage figures that you gave,
Yeah.
but how many of our resources are taken up by meat?
Yeah. It's pretty astonishing, isn't it? Yeah, 97% for difference between beef and plant-based beef. And it's, if any of you have had an Impossible Burger, I'm personally not actually the biggest fan of burgers. We didn't eat much beef. Chinese people, they need a lot of beef. But I haven't had a burger in a long time, obviously. But I did have an Impossible Burger, and I was pretty shocked by how meat-like it felt. And I'm not going to pretend it's a health food, so don't eat too many of them. I think eating mostly real plants is better than processed plants, but still, even from a health perspective, it's much healthier too. I think there's good evidence that because it's lower in kind of saturated fats, some of the worst fats, and some of the bad forms of cholesterol, it's healthier for you too.
Global warming is a better term. Climate change is an obfuscation emphasized by climate deniers to neutralize the discussion. Would you like to comment about that?
Yeah, so the reason the terminology changed from global warming to climate change is because the effect of greenhouse gas emissions isn't just increase global temperatures. So, for example, there's extremely compelling evidence now that increasing global greenhouse gas emissions cause more extreme weather events. And that's not necessarily just increase in temperatures. That's more hurricanes. It's more droughts. It's more famines. But also because some of the most terrifying potential implications of rising greenhouse gas emissions may involve long-term global cooling. So let me explain that for a moment. There's a very important system in the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans called the thermohaline system. And the thermohaline system is, as you might imagine from, if you know the etymology of the word thermohaline, is a system where the cool water in the North Atlantic sinks to the bottom of the ocean. And it creates a cycle. So what you see in the Atlantic Ocean is the cool water, historically, because the Arctic regions of the planet are cooler, will sink to the bottom of the ocean and create a cycle that's called the thermohaline system. And most of the planet Earth is aquatic, it's ocean. If you look at just the amount of square footage on the planet Earth, most of it is ocean. And the oceans have these incredibly powerful currents that actually drive a lot of terrestrial environmental outcomes. And in particular, the thermohaline system in the North Atlantic pushes a huge amount of warm air, because when the warm water is shifting to the north, when the cold water sinks, it also pushes warm air to the north, which is why in North America and Northern Europe, and by Northern Europe I mean even Spain and France, I don't just mean Scandinavia, why they're unusually warm, right? Because you have the Gulf Stream, you have these warm currents of water that are pushing warm bodies of air to the north. Now, what climate change and greenhouse gas emissions have done is they slowed down the thermohaline system. And there's a real fear, and there was actually just a study, I think, last year that was published in, I think it was Nature or Science, saying there's a real probability, not only is this going to slow down, it's going to stop entirely. And the reason is because it's so hot in the Arctic. Again, the polar ice caps are all melting. It's warm. This is why the polar bears are going extinct. But it's not just polar bears that are threatened by that. Because the cold water is no longer sinking and the water is no longer cycling, it's possible the thermohaline system shuts down. And if that does happen, ecologists predict there will be an ice age. Global temperatures in Northern Europe and North America could drop by 10 degrees Celsius or more within a span of a decade or a couple decades, right? Which would mean all of us, and that's not just about us having to put our coats on and turn on our heaters. It means all the land we grow our crops on will die too. Because you cannot grow crops when you are living in a frozen tundra, right? And this, in fact, events like this have happened. There's an event called the Younger Dryas event. I think it's about 10,000 years ago, approximately, that led to a mass extinction. And that was partly because of a global cooling event. So I do agree that global warming, from a PR perspective, is in some ways a better term, because climate change just sounds kind of neutral. And I know a lot of publications, like The Guardian, I think, has now shifted away from calling it climate change to climate crisis, which may be better marketing. But I do think the move that scientists made about 15, 20 years ago, and I was actually a researcher researching environmental policy at Northwestern at the time, there was a deliberate shift in terminology by scientists who were having meetings at places like the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which is the UN consortium that puts together all the best research on things like agriculture. And they said, we really need to stop calling this global warming, because the number of impacts far exceed just rising temperature. It's not just about us getting a little hotter. It's about changing life as we know it because of environmental disruption.
Here's one. I agree with your view about the need to switch to plant-based diet. But what do we do about the reality that in this country and around the world, many, if not most, vegetable workers are in very oppressive conditions, often unable to afford food for themselves and their families?
Yeah, that is a fantastic question. And obviously in California especially, hopefully most of us are at least vaguely familiar with the farm workers movement, which is such an important movement. Cesar Chavez and Marshall Gantz. Marshall Gantz is one of the intellectual founders of the paradigm that I organize under, kind of decentralized nonviolent resistance. And he was an organizer of Cesar Chavez in the 1970s. The first thing I'll say about this is, given that animal-based foods are the source of most of the both concentration of power and just the sheer land use. If you're trying to reduce the exploitation of workers, moving towards plant-based foods is a great way to do that. Just because of the sheer reduction in power and reduction in land use caused by the switch to plant-based foods. The second thing I'll say, though, is to the extent we build a movement that can challenge the political power of some of these big factory farm conglomerates that are able to get, again, 2% rates on water, it's like we're living in a drought. Why are they getting a 98% discount and we're getting like a 500% surcharge? You know? And that power dynamic, if we can reverse that power dynamic on environmental issues and on animal rights issues, we will also be able to reverse it on workers' rights issues. And the problem right now, to me, is, and this is, I'm going to say something controversial, the Democrats and Republicans alike are kind of in bed with animal ag. It's a pretty bipartisanly corrupt industry. And you know, if you look at a lot of the donations from a lot of big ag corporations, I mean, the Farm Bureau of California gives a lot to Democrats. And I won't say it's, corruption is a strong word. And when I say corruption, I'm just reminded of Hannah Arendt's comment about the banality of evil. It's not really about the malice of good people, because I think there are a lot of good Democrats, and frankly, probably good Republicans too, who don't want to see things like this. And I mean, who wants to see 18,000 animals burned alive? I mean, nobody wants to see these things. The problem with the banality of evil and the problem with both the Democratic and Republican Party is there are not enough people like you who are educated and empowered to go tell our elected officials that's not okay. You know? We should not be giving them a 98% discount and charging ordinary people 500% surcharge on the water. We should not be using 97% of the land we have to be, 97% of the land we should not be using, and only 3% is what we need when we could be making plant-based meats. So let's do something to our food system on a systemic and policy level to reverse this. But until we reverse that and get enough political power to fight back against these big ag corporations, the farm workers, the environment, and the animals alike will suffer.
Regarding Brazil and the Amazon rainforest, has Lula da Silva significantly improved on Bolsonaro's policies?
Honestly, in my view, no. And the key term is significant. I'm not saying there's not a difference. And of course, you don't want perfection to be the enemy of good. And I think Lula, in so many ways, is so much better than Bolsonaro. But the reality is, Lula and Bolsonaro are both captive to larger forces at play. And the larger forces at play are this. And this. They're captured by the fact that, the Brazilian farmers and ranchers, at least the workers on the ground, the big companies like JBS, I have no empathy for them. But certainly a lot of the employees for JBS that are doing things like this to the Amazon, they're trying to make a living. And the way for them to make a living, when people in the United States and Europe, who are eating most of the products they're buying, choose this over this, is for them to continue doing it. And Lula is captive to those forces. He only has so much power. Now, if we decided to shift towards this food system and spent some of the huge amount of money and energy and waste maybe investing in global educational systems and investing systems so the people of Brazil could make products like this instead of like this, then I think Lula would actually have the power to make real change. But because so much of what Brazil needs to survive depends on destruction of the environment, Lula and Bolsonaro alike, I'm not saying Lula is not better. I think he is better, for sure. And I think he's enforcing laws more. There's less corruption in the Brazilian government. And he's an activist. He served how many years in jail? This is someone who really does believe in trying to do the right thing. But even someone who's really trying to do the right thing and is an incredibly brave person who's risked his own freedom for what he believes in is subject to more fundamental economic forces that are driving these outcomes. Yeah, follow up?
No, I was just wondering if we could take a question from the floor.
Yeah, why don't we finish these
Yeah,
first?
sure.
And then, yeah.
Okay. Can you please talk about the use of water for almonds? Also, is there any good use of goats for the environment, for versus for meat or milk. Are goats ruminants? What can we do about the water use of animal farming? What's the next effective step we should be taking? That's quite a lot of
Yeah,
questions.
so almonds are a significant contributor. There's no question about that. They're large. But again, still much smaller cumulatively than animal agriculture, right? The Colorado River is pretty representative, 56% to animal-based agriculture and about 23% to plant-based agriculture. So, if we could reduce the number of almonds in this state, I would probably do it, but it's still not going to even really have even a rounding or sort of impact if we don't do anything about the animal-based water usage. So the second question was about goats. Goats are ruminants. They're used much less frequently than sheep in the United States. We don't eat a lot of goat meat. We don't drink much goat milk. We don't actually eat much lamb. Interestingly, lamb, 1,500 years ago, was actually a pretty important product. So like in World War II, mutton. Mutton used to be a thing. If you read any books from like the early 20th century, like Steinbach, if you read one of his books from the 19th or early 20th century, they always talk about eating mutton. It's like, why is everyone eating mutton? And that's shifted a lot. So there still is some lamb production and sheep production in the United States. It's much smaller. But goats are ruminants. I think anytime you're placing a kind of vulnerable population of human beings or animals into a commercial or a capitalistic setting, there's going to be misuse. And certainly that's going to happen with goats too. So many of you have probably seen these goat herds around the Bay Area. Like in East Bay, you'll sometimes see goat herds on the highway medians. So they are creating greenhouse gases by destroying all that plant life and emitting a lot of the carbon dioxide that's locked into that plant life into the atmosphere because they are ruminants. But also just the treatment of the animals in those industries often isn't the best. So for separate ethical reasons, I'm not super excited about really the use of any animal. I think the paradigm for us to think about for both natural systems and natural ecosystems and other living creatures is similar to the paradigm we use for juveniles. And there was a time period in this country and around the world where child labor was very common, and there were a lot of arguments for it. A lot of companies wanted to use child labor, and it's still happening, unfortunately, even in this country. You've probably seen some of the reports about migrant labor, 12, 13-year-old kids. And very interestingly, and this relates to what I was saying about farm workers, one of the most common unlawful uses of migrant labor, including child labor in the United States, you want to guess what it is? Factory farms and slaughterhouses, yeah. It's one of the most common, I think it might be the number one common, and it's because these jobs are very unpleasant, they're very dangerous, cause a lot of sickness. No one really wants to work in these factory farms and slaughterhouses. So who do they pick? Well, they pick literally the 12-year-old kid who's from, Guatemala or from some other country where whether due to civil strife, environmental damage, the kids just don't have enough food and they have no future. So they come to this country, and where do we put them? We throw them in the slaughterhouse. That tells you a lot about the dynamics of a slaughterhouse and what the slaughterhouse means for both the human beings and animals, and for the people on the top at places like JBS and Smithfield and Tyson who control these operations. So, and it also tells you a lot about what we can do to reverse that, because if we create a paradigm where even children, even migrant labor, even animals have some voice in our political system and are not treated as mere commodities, that we can invert that power dynamic and make sure outcomes like this don't happen.
There was someone from the audience who wanted to ask a question.
Yeah, please.
In addition, there we go, okay? In addition to the moral and political components that were in the presentation this morning, I just wanted to call to everyone's attention, there's a huge personal health impact from moving the dial from animal-based to plant-based consumption. And so I just wanted to add that in, anti-inflammatory process in our bodies changes, shifts. And so that is another compelling reason, and maybe because it's on a personal level, that also can, help change the dial more in the direction of plant-based foods. I just want to mention it from a health point of view.
Yeah, it's a very important comment, and I will say, especially processed meats and red meats, there's extremely compelling evidence. The World Health Organization lists processed meats, which most meats now are processed meats. If you buy meat from a grocery store, it's shocking how much of it is processed, like that's bacon, ham, any sort of cured meat, chicken nuggets, are considered a group 1 carcinogen. So it's like cigarettes, basically. And a group 1 carcinogen is there's overwhelming scientific evidence this is a carcinogen. And in particular, processed meats seem to cause colon cancer, which is not a good form of cancer. It's not like prostate cancer, which prostate cancer is like slow, potentially treatable. Colon cancer is quite deadly. And yeah, I mean, I could say from just, I mean, it's just what our grandparents told us, eat your veggies. Like, it's not, it's complicated, but and there is a lot of science. I'm not saying it's trivial to understand what foods are healthy and what foods are not. But you just can look anywhere in the world, in any civilization in history, we've kind of all understood that eating more plants is better. And if we don't, you know, and I will say, like, I do think the primary reasons for me are 100% ethical, environmental, you know, first ethical, then environmental. But I'm 41 years old, about to be 42. I've been plant-based for 23 years, and I could not be happier or healthier. I mean, I could still run a 5-minute mile. Some of my classmates from law school, when I was going vegan 20 years ago, like, we're all about the same size and vitality and health, and I've seen my law school classmates have been eating steaks and bacon for the last 20 years, and how much it's just, you can just see the vitality almost seeping from them. And it's almost like metaphorical, like when we suck the vitality out of the earth and its living creatures, the vitality out of us goes away too. And if you're eating these delicious, vibrant foods like fruits and vegetables and beans, like the vitality it creates for you, like, I remember when I used to eat at KFC, like if I ate a big bucket of KFC, I mean, it felt good in the short term, but then afterwards I'd just be lethargic and I'd feel so weak. And then, you know, who's had a little box of blueberries and felt the same way? Like, blueberries are delicious and they make you feel good afterwards. You know? So I will say there are a lot of personal benefits too. So it's a very good comment.
Here's someone, I have been buying not milk and really enjoy the taste. Do you know anything about this company?
I know it's plant-based, and I think that's great. You know, there have been so many different companies producing so many different foods. And, you know, like, the nice thing is there's kind of something for everybody, because I personally am trying to avoid more processed foods, but I'm also very supportive of, especially people, if you've grown up your entire life eating McDonald's, the Impossible Burger is for you, right? That's not really for me. I'm not that I don't enjoy it, but I'm like trying to eat less processed foods. So Impossible, as wonderful as it is and environmentally friendly and ethically friendly as it is. So not milk is probably the milk. I don't like drinking milk anyways. Like, I'm lactose intolerant, so like even drinking milk makes me think, oh, am I gonna have a problem later? I won't go into the gory details, but I don't even want to think about that. So a lot of the plant-based milks, which I ate in my family, I mean, we didn't even think of plant-based milk as an alternative. Chinese people, we used to make our own soy milk from soybeans at home. And it was delicious and healthy, and we just liked it. And it was healthy, you know, it was fewer calories, less fat, it was just better for us. And it wasn't even an alternative. It was just another delicious drink for us to have.
We have a questioner here. Melvin is going to ask you a question.
Okay. In the chat, okay. I'll read it. Is it better for us to choose drink oat and soy milk than almond, or goat, or cow, or sheep? So, you know, I think all of these plant-based options, including almond milk, are better, massively better, not just small amount. And again, almonds, from a water perspective, almonds are probably worse than soy and oat milk. But there are other reasons to choose almond milk. So, for example, almond milk has fewer calories, and it tends to have fewer metabolic effects, I think, than oat. Like oats are metabolically, you know, they're higher on the glycemic index. If you have diabetes or you're pre-diabetic, maybe you need to avoid oat milk because it's going to cause reactions. So I think all of these are clearly and systematically better options than animal-based milk. So I would just say, find a plant-based milk that works for you, and let's work on refining the system of almond production so it doesn't use as much water. And the other thing is, while almonds are worse in terms of water, they're better in some other regards too, right? So soy plantations, for example, cause a lot of deforestation because they tend to be grown in areas that have a little more water intrinsically, and so there's a lot of deforestation caused by soy plantations. So they all have bad impacts. And the plant-based food systems are certainly not perfect, and there's still a lot of corporate agriculture, but it's not nearly as bad and not nearly as destructive. And honestly, if we can marshal the plant-based big ag corporations to fight against the animal-based big ag corporations, I almost think creating that sort of civil war, nonviolent, well, hopefully nonviolent civil war within big ag is probably a good thing for us. Because if these big ag conglomerates are fighting each other, then they're spending less time convincing our politicians to give them subsidies. And actually, one thing I forgot to say, which Dolores and Dave were the ones who pointed this out to me, this the reason the Colorado River, this Lake Mead image that I showed you earlier, the reason this has been in the news, Dave and Dolores sent me an article in the New York Times about this, but I already told you they already get subsidies to the point that their water rates are, depending on the exact context, but somewhere between 2%, sometimes 5% the cost that you and I pay. But there was just a deal announced because obviously this is not good, and politicians are scared of this because if people no longer have water, they're going to complain. So $1.3 billion in taxpayer subsidies, $1.3 billion in taxpayer subsidies just to pay, basically irrigation districts to not use this water, which is effectively paying factory farms to not use our water. And around the same time, almost exactly the same time, Governor Gavin Newsom just announced a huge subsidy for affordable housing. I think all of us probably recognize we probably don't want to subsidize companies that are doing this. This seems like not the right thing to subsidize, yet our government just invested $1.3 billion to doing more of this. We should be taxing them, not subsidizing them. But the reality is we're subsidizing this. How much money did Gavin Newsom, does anyone know, just like I think in April, it was, Gavin Newsom just announced this historic housing bill that we're going to make this huge investment in affordable housing. How much money did we put into affordable housing in taxpayer dollars? $600 million. So around the same time we were announcing we're subsidizing this to $1.2 billion, we're subsidizing our fellow community members who are housing insecure or unhoused entirely to about half that amount. I'm not saying that's apples to apples because obviously there's other money by the federal government, the state government that will be put into housing. But I just thought that was so metaphorically apt in terms of showing how skewed our priorities are and how much control Big Ag has. Because, all of us should think that housing seems like a really important problem. This not only does not, this seems like something we should be not subsidizing, we should be taxing this. Yet there's an announcement recently showing our government putting more money into causing more of this than they're putting into putting our friends and community members and family members into homes. Yeah.
What can be done about the fact that meat eating has become a cultural war issue? Republican politicians conflate veganism with the dreaded wokeism.
Yeah, the funniest thing about this is, so I don't know if you all heard this, but Cracker Barrel. So Cracker Barrel, has anyone been to a Cracker Barrel? So some people. Yeah, they're not that common in California. I grew up in Indiana, so I used to see Cracker Barrels all the time. But it's pretty interesting. The number of Cracker Barrels in a county is a pretty good predictor of how that county will vote in the next presidential election. And so Cracker Barrel is very Republican. It's in right-leaning places in the country. And I don't even know why. It's very confusing to me because I guess it's kind of a rustic country, feel like a cowboy when you walk in. But Cracker Barrel a few months ago announced they were going to actually sell the Impossible Burger, basically for reasons like this and this. They thought, this seems a little better than this, right? Let's do this. And because they wanted to diversify the market. They wanted people like me, or vegetarian or vegan or even just concerned about the environment to come to the restaurant. And they got bombarded with hatred, saying like, Cracker Barrel's gone woke. And many of you probably also know that one of the biggest complaints about, I think it was the Inflation Reduction Act, was there's a claim that Biden was trying to take away our beef, right? And in Fox News, this is going, kind of viral, that they're taking away our beef. They don't want us to eat burgers anymore. I'm going to say something that I also think may be a little controversial, and that is that I think we don't want to make this a partisan issue. I think we should try to listen to Republicans on this issue and understand their concerns. Now, obviously, I'm not saying the most extreme and ridiculous versions on Twitter or on TikTok. There's a lot of right-wing provocateurs, the Fox News anchors of the world, the Sean Hannitys, who I don't think we need to listen to them. But our family members, our friends, our colleagues who might be more conservative than us and will say things like, well, where am I going to get my meat? I think we should treat that question as a good faith question that we try and answer together and try and focus on the fact that there are a lot of conservative values. So for example, one of the things that conservatives hate is waste, right? They don't like wasting things. Another thing that conservatives hate is the government taking our money. And so we should be pointing out the fact that there's $1.3 billion in subsidies effectively given to big corporations and taken out of your hands. And I think one of the ways we can avoid the taint of wokeness and this culture war phenomenon is really finding framings that even conservatives can agree with. And I will say, even someone as conservative as Tucker Carlson when people, and I have a friend named Gene Bauer who's actually been on Tucker Carlson's show to debate veganism and plant-based foods. And by the end of the show, partly because Gene does such an excellent job of really listening and understanding the concerns of conservatives and the audience of conservative leaders like Tucker Carlson, by the end of the show, and I could even share the clip, Tucker is saying, you know, actually, you're one of the most reasonable guests I've had. Everything you're saying actually makes a lot of sense, and why would I want this, or why would I want this? So I think there's a way to get around the culture war polarization that's leading to gridlock, not just on climate and animal rights issues, but on so many other issues, right? On even just basic things like the debt ceiling. We can't even get that raised, causing a default for the country. I mean, granted, we did just breach a deal on that, so thankfully we overcame that obstacle. But I just think in the polarized environment we're living in today, we should try to avoid making this a Democrat versus Republican issue and just make this an American issue. We should make this a human issue for everybody.
Can you talk about the California water system that destroyed the original Save Joaquin River system in order to grow food in the Central Valley?
Yeah, I'm not an expert on this. Whoever asked that question, it sounds like you might actually know more than I do. What I do know is that our geology, our economic system, and our political system have been re-engineered to divert more water to factory farms. I mean, everything about water in the state is being driven by agriculture. And even in instances, I mean, we look at issues. I told you that there are, literally hundreds and hundreds of cattle ranchers in Brazil that are violating even the very limited laws they have, and grazing and clear cutting and burning down rainforests that have just this beautiful and so precious biodiversity that's existed on this planet for hundreds of millions of years. I will say it's happening in California as well. So we've investigated turkey farms, for example, that are regularly just dumping their sewage into the local drinking water reservoirs, into local watersheds with virtually no accountability at all. We've investigated factory farms that are not only throwing feces and, let me just show you the image again, not only throwing feces and manure and urine into these lagoons that are spreading all over the country, but antibiotics, literally like caseloads and caseloads of antibiotics are in some cases being dumped in these lagoons. Like, meaning that not only these bacteria potentially lethally infectious, which, for 30,000 Americans every year, just one bacteria, MRSA, is killing mostly children, mostly elderly, immune-compromised people, but these infections are just getting much more fatal because the water in the manure lagoons is not just, feces and urine, which, whatever you think of that, at least it's legally allowed. It's oftentimes unlawfully released antibiotics that then make the pathogens within the lagoons, within the farms, even more dangerous. And it's pretty shocking how little accountability there is, even for some of the biggest issues in California. And I'll end with this. Many of you may have heard of Prop 12. It was on the ballot in 2018. Historic ballot initiative to give animals a little bit more room to roam so they don't have to live in tiny crates like this, right? And we all celebrated this, I think, in California. About 2 out of 3 California voters voted for this. Originally, it was passed in 2008. More California voters voted to take these animals out of crates than had voted for any ballot initiative in California history. So it was a very popular initiative. And much to my surprise, the Supreme Court just upheld it, What is less known is this footage, which, my friend Julianne and her team shot. This footage is shot in Central California after then Prop 2 went into effect. So all of this is technically illegal. And so when there are environmental violations, when there are animal welfare violations, one of the problems is, and not only is it illegal, we reported the legal violation, and we even showed that the state's own investigators, they're state investigators under public health laws, not under animal welfare laws or environmental laws. They're looking at these farms and saying, hey, this is dangerous. When you have this many animals putting out this much feces and flooding the local communities and spraying into the air and the water, this is actually dangerous to human health. Because we know when you have highly congested living arrangements for human beings or animals, it's a recipe for pandemic disease, especially when the animals are immune compromised. They're not given any veterinary care. They're not quarantined. I mean, none of these animals are quarantined. I mean, when you have 14,000 cows, you don't even realize when one's sick. Like, there are 5–10% of them dying every year, and you don't even know why they die, because you're just throwing them away into landfills. And so when you have that many animals confined in such dense environments, regulators are saying this is a public health threat. And we sent to the California Attorney General and district attorneys in these counties evidence that our own regulators are saying they're violating the law, and yet to this date there's not been a single enforcement action under this proposition. Then Prop 12 to now Prop 12. It went into effect in January 1st, 2016. There's not been a single successful enforcement action, and we have hundreds of millions of animals living in environments like this, creating conditions like this for our entire state, and yet there's been no accountability.
This is a comment rather than a question. Meatless Monday for school lunches is one step to start to raise in consciousness and also change behavior in a collective way. I suggest the UUSF meals always be vegan, and I would contribute to this.
I think those are great suggestions. Whoever suggested that, I'm fully supportive. Happy to help however I can. So Meatless Mondays, eating plant-based. And the last thing I'll say is just remember what I said earlier about showers too. It is true that all of us can 3 times a day, or maybe more, maybe less, contribute to building a better planet and a kinder world for animals. But the bigger issue is policy. We all have to get active, which is one of the reasons I love the UU Church, because it's a church where people are so informed, educated, and just energized and curious about things we can do to solve the policy problem. So by all means, let's eat plant-based. Let's make a policy to eat plant-based as much as possible. But let's also organize so we can fight the big factory farms when they're trying to get subsidies, like this $1.3 billion subsidy, so they can continue to destroy our environment.
Who wants to save these questions? Somebody should be saving these questions.
Well, okay. Thank you very much, Muir. Thank you, everybody, for being here. Excellent presentation, as usual, and some important questions as well. Extremely important issue, obviously. So this ends this program. I just want to announce programs that are coming up. I did want to say one thing. I think maybe at some point it would be interesting to have a little discussion or debate about whether, in fact, this problem can be solved within the context of this system. Not that people shouldn't, be out there, as Wayne was saying, struggling in every way possible to make the changes that need to be made. But I'm personally very doubtful that this system that we live in, this capitalist system, is even capable of taking on this question because of the way it functions. But that's for another time. There's not going to be a forum next week because of the church-wide meeting that's going to be taking place here. Very important meeting. Hope everybody comes. But on June 11th, there's going to be a presentation by someone from Extinction Rebellion. There's going to be some other issues related to what Wayne was talking about today. And also, I believe it's going to have a lot of emphasis on activism. And then on June 18th, we're planning for a presentation on reparations, which also very, very, contentious, but extremely important. And I encourage everyone to put that down on their calendar. And that's it for now. That's all the plans we have for now. But we'll be sending out information to everyone about the events that are coming up. And if you're not on the email list, you can go to the back table, put your name down, and we'll send you whatever information we have available about these coming events. And also, you can send us your comments and your suggestions about what kinds of programs you want to see. So, pardon? Okay, all right. The other thing is that we are recording this, and we do have something like 35 recordings now of different forums that we have done here. And I will send out, and Jeff will send out, we have 2 different email lists, copies of or links to those, to the presentation today, and links to all those other forums if you want to go and look at those. And we only ask that if you do watch one of these programs, please like it and subscribe, because that does good things, according to Jonathan. Does really good things for us. So anyway, with that, have a good afternoon. And you know, Carnival's going on. I don't, want to take you away from the sanctuary, but Carnival's going on in the Mission District. And, you go down to Harrison. I was there yesterday. It's kind of interesting. There's a lot of people and a lot of good food and stuff like that. Anyway, that's it for my...